Good afternoon to our viewers in Germany and good morning to our viewers in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'd like to welcome all of you to our weekly Kaffeepause. Today we're joined once again by Rob Schmitz. He is an international correspondent with NPR covering Central Europe, and he is based in Berlin, which is where he actually is today. So Rob, I want to thank you again for joining us. I know that you've had a pretty crazy schedule because of all of the breaking news that's been going on in the region that you cover. But I really, really appreciate your making the time to talk with us today.
Well, thanks a lot, Steve. It's good to be here again, and looking forward to talking with everyone. Yeah, when I took this job 3 years ago, I was moving from China, and I thought I was getting away from a busy beat. And then I, 2 years into my my time here, suddenly we have a war. So
little did you know what you were getting yourself into. And that's actually a sort of a good way to start, because you were actually reporting from Kyiv before the fighting started, and I thought that maybe I'd start our conversation by asking you to sort of think back to that time when you were in Kyiv and talking to lots of people about the military buildup along the border with Ukraine, and sort of what the sentiment was, what the mood was of people. Did anybody anticipate a full-on war like the one that we're seeing unfold at the moment?
That's a good question. I think that, when I was there, so I was there for a couple of weeks at the end of January. And at that time, so this is a month before the invasion began. And at that time, and I stayed in Kyiv and was meeting regularly with parliamentarians. I met with a former defense minister of Ukraine, key government officials, veterans, people in charge of the draft there in the city of Kyiv, and then also just normal folks. And I think it varied. Many people didn't think that this would amount to anything. A lot of people thought that basically that Putin was bluffing to try and get something from the international community. But I will say, though, because I had so many interviews with veterans and the military structure within Ukraine, I got a lot of, yes, this is going to happen most likely. Those answers were pretty normal, especially for those in the know. I had a very interesting interview with the former Minister of Defense, Andriy Zagorudnyk, and he had a lot of interesting predictions that actually came to be. And he wrote about these predictions, and I can actually, I can put this in the chat. I actually have this down. If you want to read, anyone wants to read this article, It's actually it's in Russian, but obviously you can use Google Translate. I don't know how to do this. Anyway, is it Q&A or what is it more?
In the chat.
Yeah, there it is.
Put it in the chat, or I can just send it to.
I just put it in the chat.
Okay.
So awesome. If you read this was I think published at the end of January, and in this paper, Zagorudnyk basically says, and he said this in my interview too, that he thought that Russia would invade after the end of the Beijing Olympics, because Putin would want to wait for that to finish, not to offend Xi Jinping, and that he also predicted that troops would stay on in Belarus after these so-called military training exercises, because at that time, the troops in Belarus were supposedly there for a military training exercise, and they even said, I think it was Lukashenko who said that they would be leaving after that. And of course, a lot of people's answers that were leaving to Ukraine or leaving to Russia, right? And obviously we know the truth now. And so he believed that they would stay on, and that the invasion would actually come, that Russia would focus its invasion on the east in Kharkiv, and from the south in Kherson and Odessa. I mean, these are things that he wrote and he said, and he predicted pretty well. But at the time, he said, Russia's not ready to invade right now. They just don't have, the medical units that that we're seeing. And so, it was a pretty prescient interview. And I thought, after everything happened, I went back to that interview. I reread my notes, and he he was pretty straight on with that prediction. So a lot of the people in the military establishment were ready for this. They had been fighting Russia in the Donbass region for 8 years, and they knew what Russia was capable of, and they were definitely reading Putin pretty well. And I think a lot of, I would say, kind of LinkedIn people who are linked in with, who are really reading a lot of news, also, like college students, graduate students that I talked to, they also believed that it would happen, and we're getting ready to move to the countryside. And I've kept in touch with a lot of people that I interviewed there, and many people have either moved to Lviv, some have stayed in Kyiv, some, because I talked to a lot of veterans, are now fighting, they're on the front lines, and many have moved to countryside homes that they had, in central Ukraine.
So that was actually, you anticipated, what I wanted to ask you next, which is, obviously you met with a lot of people when you were there in January. And as we were talking about before we went live, I think NPR's coverage from across Ukraine has been amazing in terms of the number of people that you've had on the ground reporting from across the country. So I was curious whether you've been in touch with any of the people that you had met with in January, and sort of how they're faring. And it sounds like, many of them have dispersed. Some of them are actually fighting. But what's their assessment now about how this ends, right? I mean, I think all of us were glued to the news over the weekend, wondering what was going to happen with Mariupol and the ultimatum that was put down by the Russians. And of course, Ukraine said that they would not accept the ultimatum of evacuating the city and surrendering. So it seems like a lot of people in Ukraine, not just people with a military background, are really fighting for their country.
They are. And I think at the time, it was interesting because, like I mentioned, I was talking to a lot of veterans at that time. And, the predictions at that time were that, of course, Russia, if they wanted to, could just take Ukraine within days. Nearly every veteran, also military experts I spoke to on the ground who actually understood how the military worked in Ukraine and how far it had come since 2014, told me that no way, that actually Russia could lose this, and this could turn into a Vietnam type of situation like the Vietnam War, and that it could last a long, long time, because Ukrainians will fight to the end. They've fought against Russia before. They have a lot of experience fighting against Russian troops. And they also, I think, were extremely confident in the training that they'd received in those 8 years, a lot of it from NATO, actually. And so, but I think where does it go from here? Many folks that I've kept in touch with do not want to, they will accept nothing less than Russia just completely leaving their country. And all of them, of course, are screaming for NATO to move forward with a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Of course, that's something that is in discussions, but is obviously been something that the Biden administration is not keen to do anytime soon, nor anyone in Europe.
And I mean, undoubtedly, with the NATO summit this week, there might be something new coming out of that, but it seems as if the no-fly zone is unlikely to happen. And the question is then, of course, how NATO member states, how the West can support Ukraine in other ways. And we'll just have to wait and see how some of that pans out. I think the last time you and I spoke as part of the Kaffeepause was in November. And at the time you were reporting on the migration crisis along the border between Poland and Belarus, a very different kind of crisis from the one that we're seeing at the moment. But there has been something like 10 million people who have already been displaced as a result of the war in Ukraine, and millions of them are coming to Germany. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about sort of the German response to this new wave of refugees, but also put this movement of people into the context of what you've been following over the last 6 months or so.
Yeah, so the numbers that I have are basically, Baerbock, Annalena Baerbock, the foreign minister of Germany, announced today that the EU has changed its estimates of refugees coming out of this war from 5 million initially, that this is something that they said a couple of weeks ago, I think, to now 8 million refugees that the EU will probably have to absorb, at least for the time being. A couple 100,000 or so, about a 250,000 so far, have been registered in Germany. And the federal government has a plan on resettling these refugees and are allocating resources to the federal states to assist with housing, jobs, social welfare, and also placing children in local schools. My son's school, actually, the principal just informed all of us that we'll have 20 new students from Ukraine who will be my son's classmates. And Berlin Hauptbahnhof has turned into almost a refugee processing center, because when you go to Berlin Central Station now and you're on the platforms, there's an entire wing of the station that is processing Ukrainian refugees that are coming off the trains. This was volunteer-led up until about a few days ago. And then the city of Berlin took over, and actually there's a lot of complaints about how they're handling it, because they're not as efficient and diligent as a lot of the volunteer organizations were in these folks and meeting their needs, because these are folks who are coming, most of them women with children and elderly people who don't speak the language and need help immediately because they do not have any connections here. Oftentimes they don't have many clothes or anything with them, because it was so difficult to get on trains to get out of there. So they couldn't bring that many belongings with them. So, when we look at how this crisis, though, compares to what I was covering last year with the manufactured migration crisis that was going from Belarus into mostly Poland, I mean, it couldn't be more different in many ways, because I feel like, the Poles were sort of, they were basically a barrier for this manufactured migration event that had been masterminded not only by Lukashenko, but most likely Putin, to basically fly in many refugees from around the world, mostly the Middle East, though, from Syria and Iraq, and then help them across the border into the EU to try and destabilize the EU. Poland, of course, wasn't having that, sent many of them back, broke many international rules and Geneva conventions, and sending them back without even attempting to process them. And now when you look at Poland, you've got millions of refugees there coming into Poland, and it couldn't be more different. Their reception is, of course, incredible. They're helping people. They've got volunteer organizations. The government's doing a lot of work. So it's really night and day, and so it's an interesting juxtaposition for Poland and also for the EU. I don't think Germany was definitely open in the initial months of the Syrian refugee crisis and the North Africa and Middle East refugee crisis in 2015. And then I think quickly soured on it. But in this crisis, this war crisis, I would say that there's been a lot more open arms here in Germany, in Poland. The amount of donation drives that I'm seeing, just on the street here in my neighborhood is really incredible. I mean, we've got our son's school. The apartment building we live in organized a big van to go to the Ukrainian border. We all donated clothes and food and things like that. This is a really grassroots effort on a neighborhood level here in Germany, and I've not seen anything like this.
One of the things that I've heard is just this tremendous outpouring of support at the grassroots level, as you've talked about, of just sort of German citizens really sort of stepping up and jumping in and helping. But I guess there are sort of two questions that I have for you. I found the number of about 250,000 refugees coming to Germany a little bit lower than what I've been hearing. And one of the things that I had heard as well was, of course, there are those who are officially registered and processed, but there's also concern, recognition that there are a significant number of people who are coming to Germany because they have friends or relatives in Germany, and they're not going through that official process. And they're being absorbed and coming in. But it sounds as if the other big issue for Germany right now is the distribution of the refugees across the country, so that there's not a concentration in one place or another. And Berlin seems to be sort of getting the brunt of people who are just coming. The transportation minister had talked about sort of a national distribution mechanism. How is that working? And are the other states showing the same kind of willingness to sort of take refugees on?
I think that the states are showing willingness. I mean, we're seeing this, throughout Germany, but I don't know how well the actual nuts and bolts of this operation is working, as you might expect with something, when you leave it to the government to handle it in Germany. Oftentimes it takes a long time for things to happen. That said, it's almost on a daily basis where you see calls to make it quicker and to make sure that we can absorb the kids in schools, set folks up for jobs, these types of things. So I think it seems to be happening at a much more rapid pace than the last wave of migrants into Europe, and also at a much a much more rapid pace than anything else that the government tries to implement, when they're presented with something new like this. So I think it seems to be going okay so far, but I haven't really reported too much on that effort.
Mm-hmm. So talking about something that you have reported on, last week you had a really interesting piece about Germany's commitment to build up its military. And I think, it's important to remind our viewers that literally just days after Russian troops entered Ukraine, Olaf Scholz, the chancellor, made a speech before a special session of the Bundestag and talked about massive increases in military spending. And this is something that I think caught a lot of people by surprise. Some people would maybe say it's too little too late, but a number of people would say, wow, this is a big sea change in German defense policy. And you had a great piece on NPR last week about this, but how is that playing out at this point? Because that speech, I mean, let's face it, it was at the end of February, it was a few weeks ago. I think even people who were taken by surprise at the time have maybe calmed down a little bit, have started to internalize it. And now people are asking the question of, okay, if we can expect 100 billion euro to be invested in the Bundeswehr this year, and if we can expect Germany to meet and even increase the 2% commitment of GDP in defense spending in the years to come, how's this money going to be spent? What are the priorities? What's going to be done? And so how has that been playing out since then?
Yeah, I think those questions are still very much open. And you're right. There was this kind of euphoric period immediately following Scholz's announcement. And I think it took everyone by surprise, because there were only a handful of people in that room that actually knew that this announcement was actually going to was coming. And so suddenly, within one speech, everything with Germany's security policy just seemed to change. And so, yeah, it's been 3 weeks. We've been able to absorb it. And we have seen initial purchases and this still needs to be passed by Parliament. Of course, it probably will be passed, because I think that there's a lot of support for this cross parties, especially with the CDU. They were very happy to hear this. Mm-hmm. Despite the fact that I think the drawdown of the military happened under a CDU chancellor, but I think that they were thrilled by this news. But we've seen a first initial announcement of purchase of a few dozen F-35 stealth bombers from Lockheed Martin that will replace a 40-year-old fleet of Tornado aircraft that has been sort of rusting in airfields throughout Germany. So that initial purchase is in some ways that was actually something that's been debated for years, whether they should get the F-35 or not, and what that would mean in the the dependence that you build when and you order that from a U.S. contractor, and then suddenly you have to repair them constantly, and all of that, and it's not a European manufactured fighter. So that had been debated sort of endlessly in the years up to this, but now they're finally doing it, and so that's interesting. But I think from the military experts that I talked to here in Berlin, many folks would agree that yes, this is great, but at the same time, the military and the Bundeswehr has been so beleaguered for so long that this money will just be used to get them up to speed so that they can actually become a real military, because up to now they've really been scrapping it together. And I think that's hopefully what this will be used to do. But at the same time, I think that there's a lot of institutional red tape and bureaucracy that we've seen in the Bundeswehr that I think there's a lot of concern that all this money will be sort of caught up within that bureaucracy, and that in fact it's not that the issue is less about money as it is about fixing the red tape situation inside the Bundeswehr. And I think folks who are hopeful hope that the entire culture of the Bundeswehr changes, and that it can be made a more nimble and efficient military instead of what it has become.
I guess we've seen sort of a little bit of that sort of red tape issue play out, because as I was listening to Deutschlandradio over the weekend, there was some criticism of the defense minister Lamprecht for announcing the purchase of the F-35s even before the budget has been fully approved by the Bundestag. And then there was another piece that I heard where there was a discussion about the chancellor actually stepping in and talking about defense spending, where this is actually in the purview of the defense minister. And so it seems as if Olaf Scholz is getting involved in areas like defense, like foreign policy, and perhaps even stepping on the toes of some of his ministers.
Yeah, that's interesting. Many people on this call will know that the Bundeswehr is different from the U.S. military. This is not an army that is under the executive branch, right? This is a military that is part of parliament and actually serves parliament. So, it's a different type of force. Has different. The chancellor is not the commander in chief here, and
right.
So, but this type of interference with Scholz and everything, it raises some interesting questions. I think it's going to be an interesting year or two to watch how this money is spent, and who gets to decide how it is spent, because I think that we're just beginning the arguments over that. And but I think that stepping back from the weeds like that, when you look at how this decision has played inside the region, that also is interesting to me, because I think for years, it's so many years, Germany's neighbors and NATO members have really, in some ways, just begged Germany to rebuild its military.
Mm-hmm.
There was a quote in my piece. It was actually a quote of a quote. One of the military analysts I interviewed, I think, quoted a former Polish foreign minister who said, "I'm not scared of a strong German army. I'm scared of a weak one." Right. And I think that's been needed for a long time. Obviously, Trump had been badgering Germany for throughout his presidency about the same issue. Obama as well. And so I think this is Germany now stepping into the 21st century with all of its unpredictability, with the rise of large, well-funded autocratic countries on their doorstep, as well as at China. And we should also mention that I think it's interesting to look at how, and a couple of military analysts told me this as well, that I thought raised interesting points, was that Germany is also a little worried about the United States, that the U.S. After the 2016 election and the Trump presidency, that this shifted the calculus inside of Germany about, okay, can we really depend on this country to defend us?
So,
and wouldn't it be a lot more secure if we actually had our own military that could actually do a little more than basically nothing, which, other than these small peacekeeping missions? And I think that all of these things are being considered. It's not just Russia. We're looking at, a more assertive China. We're looking at political unpredictability in the United States, and this need for more sovereignty for security inside of Europe.
yeah, I mean, actually, that's one of the things that I had also wanted to ask you about, because it's something that was hinted at in the piece, this question about America's reliability. One of the analysts that you spoke with, somebody who we've had as a guest before as well, Jana Puklerin, in your piece talked about how people would say, thank God we have the United States to rely on, and that's something that's being called into question. And if we think about, the narrative of the past few months, Germany welcomed President Biden with his statement, America is back, and then asked for how long. And so this sort of sparked a debate in Germany about America's reliability moving forward and what happens in the next election, and sort of the oscillation of US foreign policy. And then, of course, the reliability of Germany was called into question as the crisis with Russia over Ukraine was unfolding. So undoubtedly, a lot of different factors are contributing to this sea change in German foreign and security policy. And I guess the big question that I have, and this is something that nobody can really know, is how durable is this commitment? Is this really something that's just sort of a flash in the pan because of the war in Ukraine and because of the need to respond accordingly? Or does this really mark a sea change in German policy moving forward, and will really sort of set the trajectory for the next decades?
Yeah, I mean, you've just put your finger on the essential question with this, and we won't know that. And I think one would hope that this is a sea change. I think many Germans, despite the level of pacifism inside this country, I think what's happening in Ukraine has really been a wake-up call for many people, that war can suddenly appear on their doorstep, that things tomorrow may not be the way they have been, and that we need to be prepared. And so I think on the street level here, there's been a pretty quick realization. I think Scholz's announcement was met with a lot of support, not only in the Bundestag, but also among just normal, even in Berlin, which is, you're not going to have that much support to rebuild a military in this city.
Yeah.
But I think people here also realize, gosh, they're seeing it. They're on the front lines. I mean, we're seeing it at Hauptbahnhof, right? You're seeing refugees coming out of this. You're seeing this horrible war. And, everyone knows, it's a 12-hour drive to Ukraine from here.
Yeah.
It's a 2-hour flight. This is literally, this is next door. So, and you don't know, nobody knows what Putin might be capable of should he be successful in this campaign.
I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, people are seeing this, but they're also feeling it when it comes to energy prices, right? Because I mean, that's another factor that I think a lot of people are having to address. This is true not just in Germany, but across Europe, that energy prices are spiking, and it's undoubtedly going to be one of the topics that is discussed at the European Council Summit this week, sort of how to deal with spiraling costs. But it seems as if Germany is really trying to work on that. I think that the Vice Chancellor and Economics Minister and Minister for Energy Policy, Robert Habeck, is traveling to the Middle East at the moment. He was just in Doha. He's now in the United Arab Emirates, and he's looking at how to diversify Germany's energy sources. Just in the last couple of days, he was trumpeting a new agreement with Qatar for liquefied natural gas. And so it seems as if there's a real attempt to in the short term, try to diversify energy sources. But this too comes incredibly late. Are you following the story about Germany's energy conundrum?
Yeah, I am, and it's fascinating to watch a government that usually is so slow at everything it does suddenly scramble, like this. It's really interesting to watch. I mean, Habeck was in Qatar over the weekend. They announced a new deal, energy deal, LNG deal, as you mentioned. Germany is scrambling to diversify where it gets its gas. It has announced that it will construct 2 LNG terminals. Can you imagine how long that's going to take? I mean, this isn't going to be a reality for years. I mean, just the environmental review process on anything like that in Germany would take years. So that's not a realistic thing in the short term. So in the short term, I think what they're trying to do is to get these new LNG contracts in place so that that gas can start appearing, hopefully at the soonest next year, maybe hopefully by next winter. I mean, it's somewhat fortuitous. There's nothing fortuitous about this, but there's somewhat fortuitous that this happened in the spring because we're, obviously in the spring, summer, fall, you're not using as much natural gas as an economy. You start using it in the late fall in Germany. And so they do have about 7 or 8 months to figure this out. Meanwhile, the price of everything is skyrocketing. We just got a producer index today showing 26% inflation on gas, on things like oil, you name it. The prices at the pump are skyrocketing here, just like they are in the United States. But I think Germany is far more susceptible to this issue than perhaps the United States because it depends on Russia for a third of its gas, a third of its crude oil, and half of its hard coal. So this is an issue. I think with the coal and the oil, it can probably figure out short-term solutions pretty quickly. The gas, it cannot. And even Habeck has admitted that. And so what's the solution? I guess the solution right now is to try and sign contracts with LNG distributors, get them to come to the nearest LNG terminals, which I think would be in Denmark, the Netherlands. There are, I think, more than 30 LNG terminals in Europe, but a lot of them are down in Spain and Portugal and
in the south.
Europe. And so it's difficult to get, you can't really get that gas to Germany from there. There's no pipeline in place that'll be able to do that. But you can from places that are closer to Germany, geographically. And so I think that's what they're trying to do. It's not going to be, it'll be somewhat successful, but they're going to have to continue to rely on Russia for their gas. And this is incredibly difficult. You've got a Green Party, the highest representative of the Green Party admitting that we're going to have to keep depending on Russia. So this is a wake-up call.
And I mean, I think Robert Habeck has been sort of making that wake-up call even before the war started. He came out very early to say Germany had not met its goals in its energy transition in the past few years, and that in the next few years, it's not likely to meet those goals in any case, right? And that's a tremendous problem. It's a tremendous amount of pressure that Germany is under. One of the questions that I've posed to a number of our guests over the last few weeks has been whether there's any likelihood that Germany might keep some of its nuclear reactors online for a little bit longer. They're slated to all be turned off by the end of this year. I saw you shaking your head. I mean,
that's not going to happen.
That there's no way that's going to happen.
No, they've gone too far down that path of decommissioning nearly every single plant. I think there are 3 left. And also the entire nuclear power industry has moved on from Germany. They're not on board with this plan because for them, I mean, they're after profit. Germany's already made that commitment. Yeah. How do you then convince the industry to come back to Germany for 5 years or so that we can handle this? That's not. There's no capitalist in the world that would do that. That's not a long-term plan, for keeping profits. So no, I don't see that happening. you're going to see blackouts before you probably see that. I would imagine.
Rob, energy, of course, is just one of the sort of economic ties between Russia and Germany. And you mentioned before we went live that you're working on a piece about some of Germany's business ties with Russia. I know that story is still in its early stages, but is there anything that you can share with us about sort of that connection between German business and Russia, and what sort of an impact the war, but also the sanctions are having on German business?
Yeah, from what I can tell, I mean, this is again, we're looking at another sea change. I mean, this is another area where, just like the energy sector, and a lot of times, they coincide, because there's a lot of industry that uses natural gas directly into their factories, right? Where you have a considerable amount of businesses within Germany that really depend on Russian commodities and those trade relationships with Russia for their revenue. This now is being impacted quickly by sanctions and by the worsening situation. And so I'm heading today, actually, right after this call, getting on a plane to Dusseldorf, going to Duisburg to speak to actually visit a steel foundry. Last time I think I set foot in a steel foundry was in China. Hopefully this one will be a little safer. And I'll be interviewing the CEO of this steel company, who definitely needs Russia and is going to be scrambling now to find new customers. And so I think, this is just the micro of the macro. And I think the macro wise, you're looking at businesses and, a lot of Mittelstand companies that are suddenly going to have to change everything that they're doing to pivot and find new markets, find new partners. It's a really turbulent time, and this is going to only contribute to inflation and a lot of other problems that we're seeing in the overall economy in Germany. So I think it'll be interesting to find more out about it. Like I said, I'm early on in doing the story, but from what I've seen, there's a lot of, first of all, there's a lot of reluctance to talk to a journalist about this, because I think, and whenever you see a story like that where no business will talk to you about it, right, you can guess that it's bad, right? Obviously, there's nothing good out of that. The ones that are talking to me are looking for other customers and hoping that the US market that listens to the story might call them, or B, are completely against any business with Russia, because there are some businesses like that in Germany. And I'm going to have an interview today, actually, later today, with a CEO of another business who has been very vociferous about other companies and his colleagues who are doing business in Russia, and that we cannot do business with Russia anymore.
But Rob, I guess it's about a lot more than Russia, right? I mean, I'm thinking back about German history, right, and the fact that the German Wirtschaftswunder, the economic wonder, was partly due to export-led growth, and that this has been sort of the narrative of post-war German strength, that it has been such a strong exporting country. This has led to incredible relationships, but also incredibly sort of mutually dependent relationships with places like Russia, but also places like China. And so I'm sort of curious as to whether this crisis with Russia right now is also calling into question the relationship that Germany has with China, for example, in terms of its dependence there.
Absolutely. And I think that those questions in the last year have been on the rise, and we've seen that not only in Germany, but we've seen that throughout Europe as China's become a little more aggressive in how it operates, especially with the pandemic. I think that soured a lot of Europeans on China, and now and it seems like should China support Russia in this campaign? I think that just seals the deal. I don't see how a business would want to, say, okay, China's our continued future here, because if China's choosing to back Russia in this, you can guess that perhaps, and you have to think about the Taiwan question in China too, because China's watching this campaign by Russia very, very closely, because it wants to see the international reaction to something like this, if indeed it wants to retake or take, I shouldn't say retake, wants to take Taiwan.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's what's happening, politically. But I think that when you're a business, you have to be thinking about the uncertainty and the instability that can create as well. Yeah. And so you're forced to look at other markets.
So Rob, as we come to a close, I'd like to come back to a topic that we've basically all been talking about for the last 2 years, and that one of our viewers said, many of us are probably tired of this, but it's COVID. Because here we are, we've passed the 2-year mark in terms of the introduction of COVID restrictions, certainly in the US, but also in Germany. And in Germany right now, we're seeing a lifting of COVID prevention measures. As a matter of fact, over the weekend was announced as being Freedom Day. And this is coming at the same time as cases are continuing to go up in Germany. Hospitals beds are still being occupied by people with COVID at increasing numbers. Granted, it's flattening out a little bit, but the numbers are still going up. And at a time when Germany is expecting an influx of refugees from Ukraine who, let's face it, have not been vaccinated to the level of people in Germany and who have had bigger issues to deal with than maintaining social distance or wearing a mask. And so I guess my concern is that, as good as it is that Germany is accepting all of these refugees, they're not necessarily coming without having COVID. So how are people responding to the lifting of these preventive measures as cases are continuing to go up? How much of a role does COVID play in Germany right now? Or have people basically sort of forgotten about it because there are bigger issues at play?
All of the above, I think. I think that it depends on if you have children. It depends on how old your parents are, and whether you have people with pre-existing conditions in your family. I think people in those groups are very concerned about this and think that the government is moving too fast with relaxing these rules. We're looking at now, I think it's basically every state has filed for an extension on the relaxing of these rules. But even with that extension, I think it's in April now, where at least in schools, masks will no longer be required. Mm-hmm. And so for me as a parent, that's really concerning, especially given that the incidence rate right now, I think I looked at it today, it was 1,700 and something. Mm-hmm. And that's another record. And so COVID is raging. The Omicron variant is raging in Germany, and yet they're relaxing these rules. Masks won't be required starting in April, I think it is, in most public places, but still on trains and transport. But still, yeah, this is something that I think a lot of people are worried about. But again, Berlin is a young city. There's a lot of people in their 20s and 30s, don't have kids. They are more than ready for everything to be relaxed. Mm-hmm. And so there's that attitude as well, is that just like in the States, people are suffering from COVID fatigue. Mm-hmm. They're tired of wearing masks. They're tired of thinking about it all the time. They want to move on. And if they get infected, then so be it. And I think that attitude is also pretty prevalent, mm-hmm. Here, especially here in this city. So I think, it's interesting. But up until now, when I've traveled to the US, my wife lives in Texas, a place where masks are extremely optional, if not non-existent. And we were both pretty surprised at just the lack of masks anywhere. And when we came back to Berlin, it was somewhat comforting to see everyone with masks at the airport, on the train, mm-hmm. at the grocery store. They'll still have it at the airport, on the train, but not at the grocery store and not at schools. And that's what worries me.
It is. I mean, here in New York, it's similar, right? It's interesting. You still see some people with masks. People are supposed to wear masks on public transit. Not everybody does, but you do not see people wearing masks as frequently in stores or in other areas where I would hope that people would continue to do so, but they're not. Well, Rob, I want to thank you so much for taking the time at what is really a very busy period for you to check in with us. I always really appreciate our conversations and hearing your insights. And so let me just wish you well. I know you have a plane to catch, so safe travels, but also stay healthy, particularly as things sort of are changing in Germany when it comes to how one deals with COVID.
Stephen, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
It was great to talk to you, and take care for you, but also for all of our viewers. Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to future discussions with you, Rob, but also with others in the weeks ahead.
Thanks a lot.